Hello and welcome back to Christianity 125. We have finished the Old Testament section and are moving into the section on the New Testament. So today, in these series of lectures and videos, we will be talking about the New Testament canon in general, and we're also going to give some background, Jewish and Greco-Roman background to the writing of the New Testament. General information about the New Testament. There are 27 books in the New Testament canon, and all of these books originally were written in the Greek language. We'll talk a little bit more later about why that is. You can see right here, this is ancient Greek. This was all capital letters, no spaces, so difficult for us to translate today, but this is what it would have looked like in the early and original manuscripts. Now, today, the New Testament has been translated into almost 2,000 different languages around the world. So even though it started in Greek, it's been in many, many other languages throughout history. Some vocabulary that you might need to know here. First, a manuscript is actually one of the copies of an original writing, but the very first manuscript that was written, the actual paper on which Paul sat down and wrote a letter, is called the autograph. So the autograph is the very first original manuscript of a writing, and we do not have any of these original autographs from the New Testament. We have copies and copies of copies, but no original ones. They would not have probably survived up to this point, because papyrus paper is pretty delicate. But we do have so many copies that we're able to compare to make sure that we know as close as we can what is actually in the original autograph of each New Testament book that we have. And you look over the span of history, we have dug up many different pieces of manuscripts, and we have almost 6,000, so 5,700 or so manuscripts that date from the 2nd century all the way to the 14th centuries, CE or AD. Let's watch this brief video here, just giving you an idea of how the early church kept, copied, and preserved the manuscripts of the New Testament.
So how did the first copies of the New Testament make it around the world? And how did they put these books together? Remember, churches back then didn't have digital tablets or email. They didn't even have copy machines. All they had were pens, papyrus, animal skins. Early churches kept their original copies of the New Testament texts until they wore out. Around the year 200, a really important church leader named Tertullian told how the churches in Corinth, Philippi, Thessalonica, Ephesus, Rome still had the original letters that Paul had sent them. By that time, these letters were 150 years old. But no matter how well they took care of the letters, they couldn't last forever. And that's why early Christians made copies of these letters. Remember, no e-readers, no emails, no copy machines, no printing presses. Only papyrus, reeds, ink, and animal skins, copies made by hand. So what did churches do with these copies? Well, they kept their copies in special book chests in the homes of members. If one church didn't have a particular letter, a nearby congregation might loan their copy of the text, so that that church could have its own copy too. When a writing passed from one church to another, each church also passed on an oral tradition, an oral history, a story about where this text came from. The tradition traced the text all the way back to an eyewitness of Jesus, so they knew exactly whose authority this text represented. Today, scholars have discovered more than 5,600 ancient pieces of the New Testament. That's more fragments and full manuscripts than any other text in the entire ancient world. More than Plato, more than Aristotle, more than Homer. The earliest of these New Testament fragments comes from about the year 100, when eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus were still alive. So why is this so important? Well, even though the men and women who copied the scriptures were so careful, they sometimes made some mistakes. And yet, because there are so many copies of the New Testament, scholars can compare the texts and figure out what words the authors originally wrote. You see, God has preserved his word in such a way that the message we possess today is without any doubt the same message he inspired so long ago.
All right. moving on, here I've listed the 27 books of the New Testament in their canonical order, so starting with Matthew and ending with Revelation. But I've made some notes throughout. We're going to be talking a little bit about genre as we read and interpret the New Testament. So there are different kinds of literature in the New Testament. Just like in the Old Testament, there was law and narrative and poetry. The New Testament is the same. The first 4 books of the New Testament are considered Gospels, and we'll talk more about what that genre is. It's sort of a new genre in history at this time. Acts is considered history, a certain kind of history, and maybe even biography. The rest of the New Testament, with the exception of Revelation, are considered epistles or letters, and there are particular rules about reading letters that we'll talk about when we get to that part. But there are many letters from Paul, so we call them the Pauline epistles, here in Romans through Philemon. And I've marked different letters. There are Paul's prison letters, and I've marked them with asterisks here. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. There are 3 books that are considered the pastoral letters, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And then some of the other epistles that aren't Paul's are sometimes thought of as sermons. They may have been sermons or little tracts that people passed around, and that eventually became letters. So Hebrews is one of those, James, and 1 John as well. The very last book in the New Testament is Revelation, and it belongs to a very special genre. It does have epistle in it, and prophecy as well, but it also contains a lot of apocalyptic literature, which is a genre of its own, which we will discuss when we get to Revelation. So if you remember when we talked about the Old Testament, it took many years for the Israelites to collect the stories, pass them down, write them down, and collect them. And a lot of the reasons that they wanted to collect their authoritative writings happened because, in exile, when they are out far away from their land, they wanted to retain their teachings and their stories. So that in the New Testament, it's a little bit different. The New Testament started being written down and collected near the middle of the 1st century CE or AD. And at this point, the apostles of Jesus and other eyewitnesses were beginning to pass away. And so they wanted to make sure that all the remembrances of these disciples were collected and written down. And so that's one reason they started trying to write down and collect a New Testament canon. Also, in these first decades of the Christian church, there were many false teachings floating around. It was difficult because I didn't have one set of authoritative writings yet. And so everything was word of mouth. So Christian teachers would go from church to church and teach, but then there were other people who would spread sort of false teachings. So in order to make sure all Christians sort of believed similar ideas about Jesus and about God and about humanity, they said we need to have a set amount of writings that we say these are authoritative for us, and if anything disagrees with these, then we're not going to have those in our community. So that's another reason they decided to collect a New Testament canon. But then they also wanted to spread the gospel and tell about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection to many people far away. And it is helpful to have written documents to help spread the gospel and make sure that the teaching that's going far and wide is going to be accurate teaching. So all of these reasons played into them trying to collect these writings that the churches have been using into one larger book or canon of the New Testament canon. Now we're going to get into a little bit of historical background to the New Testament. It's so important to understand the time period, the rulers, the empires that led up to the time period of Jesus and the apostles in order to understand the New Testament and the writings of the New Testament. So just some of this is going to be review from our Old Testament lecture, but just to give you an overview of Israel's history up to this point. Of course, we talked about in Genesis and other places that the people of Israel were formed by God really to be a blessing to the nations, and they had a long history of rebelling against God, but then God bringing them back into the fold, and then they were in slavery, and then they had judges and they had monarchs. So a long period of Israel's history, and the Old Testament tells us that, and their relationship with God and how that plays out. But once we get into the Babylonian period, when the Jews were in exile in Babylon, this is when we start seeing important changes in history that will affect the New Testament and the time period that Jesus is alive. So if you'll remember, from 587 to 539, this is when many Jews were in exile in Babylon. Some of them had remained in Jerusalem, but there was not much for them to do with the temple destroyed and Jerusalem pretty much razed as well. Then we move into the Persian period, and also a period of restoration for the Jews. The Persian period, of course, Cyrus of Persia comes in and defeats the Babylonians, and when he takes over, he allows the Jews to go back to their homeland, to go back to Jerusalem. And so that period from 539 to 333 BC lasts a very long time. Now, looking at the broader scope of history, the Persians were defeated by the Greeks. And so when they came in, the Greeks also defeated Israel as well. So we're going to call this period the Hellenistic period, and we'll talk a lot more about that in a second. And the next period of Israel's history involves Israel actually ruling itself. That doesn't happen very often in history, but the Hasmonean period is when the Jews rose up against their oppressors and in their Maccabean revolt, and they were able to rule themselves for almost 100 years. And then, of course, the big bad Roman Empire comes in 63 BCE and takes over Israel. And then we have the Roman period, which is when the New Testament times happened, and also when the New Testament was written. Just to show you some of the background, I can't remember if I showed you this map before, but just as I just talked about the Babylonian exile, here shows when they came and defeated the southern kingdom, and then of course when the Assyrians had defeated the northern kingdom, just to give you sort of a big picture view of the area and the time period there. Some of the things that are important for the New Testament, or the changes that happened in Israel during exile, while they were in exile. First of all, the people adopted the language of Aramaic, which was spoken in Babylon, and of course they were there for quite a while, so they, in order to interact with the Babylonians, they started speaking Aramaic. And now this is important for New Testament studies because Aramaic was the language that Jesus probably spoke. Though the New Testament is not written in that language, it is probably what Jesus spoke. Another thing that happened was that because there was no temple, the temple had been destroyed, of course, by the Babylonians, the synagogue began to develop as the hub of worship for Jews. So they would have, these were local congregations of people that came together to read scripture, to pray together, to be the people of God together. So the synagogue developed during the time of exile, and it was the major place for worship during the first century when Jesus was going around and teaching. People did still go to the temple for holidays and things like that, but most everybody would go to the synagogue on a daily or weekly basis for their worship. Another thing that happened during exile, and you might have noticed the shift in my language, the people of Israel became known as the Jews during exile, and they kind of solidified the idea that they were going to worship only one God, monotheism, because they looked back and saw that the main problem, the reason that they were in exile, they believed, was because they were not being faithful to the one God, Yahweh, and were instead worshiping other gods. So these three changes are important background information as we move into the New Testament times. I think we might want to stop here because we're about to run out of time on the video. I will start back up again with the Persian period.